Next is Claudia, and Claudia is going to keep talking about some of this work, but move bigger.
Yes, great. Thank you, Tina. This was a great setup. So what I'll focus on is a bit more on why we undertook the climate region modeling with Tina and Tony Lynn's help, and how that will be used in the decision-making and planning. So the need grew out of a larger collaborative research and conservation needs assessment for Reina Borealis that we undertook with many partners while I was still with Fish and Wildlife Service. And so this slide just shows you all the partners that were involved. Next slide. And it basically grew out of the recognition that this is a large range for the species. We have a set of tools in our toolbox of what we can do, but the really difficult choice is where we invest our limited conservation dollars. And then we also need to understand when and for how long. And so that's really why we needed the help of Tina's climate refugia model. The idea is really we want to understand how to prioritize the conservation investments across the landscape by understanding where the frog's habitat is buffered from climate change impacts and for how long, and really understand also how long you would want to make an investment in a particular frog population before you need to start considering translocation. And that's really how we're structuring the discussion and the climate adaptation planning with this collaborative. And so one of the concerns was that there was an apparent range contraction in the south. And so looking at the overall range, we decided that we're going to start to focus in on just the Sierra clade. And that is the one that is along in the geography where we undertook the climate refugia modeling. And so luckily we have a pretty healthy foundation in decision science that can help us figure out how to use the climate refugia modeling effort into our conservation planning. And that's really what I'll talk a little bit about, how we're basically incorporating the science into this decision making. And one aspect of this project is really that we wanted to test the assumption how management actions will enhance the frog populations under current and future climate change. And then we also wanted to develop indication of when management actions are no longer effective and when we need to change our approach. Again, as I mentioned, that the current focus is on in situ head starting, where you basically take frog eggs and you protect them from predation, but also from scouring in these baskets. And you basically just rear the egg masses in situ and then release either tadpoles or small frogs into the environment. But at some point that investment becomes unsustainable if you have too much predation from American bullfrog, or you get early drying out of your intermittent streams. So this is really where we're starting to apply sort of like that GRAT framework. And so next slide. I keep clicking on my computer. Next slide. Thank you. So the figure that you see here shows the schematic of the PROACT cycle, or the structured decision-making cycle that we're going through as part of our planning process. And it looks very similar to the adaptive management cycle, the climate smart cycle, or many cycles that you've seen before. And I just want to stress a small difference, and that is that it really starts eliciting very early on with a focus on identifying the values and objectives of the decision maker. So really early on, the focus is on what does success look like from this decision maker's perspective based on agency's mission, authority, and then also the decision maker's values and preferences. And so this process allows us to then choose the optimal set of management actions that will get at these preferred values that were expressed in the beginning. And so we're using Tina's climate refugia model to inform the where to choose what actions we want to implement. We're also using the expert elicitation to understand how actions will improve the survival rates, and use an integrated demographic population model to assess the expected population level outcomes based on these management decisions, and see if they meet the preferences and expectations for outcomes for the managers. And then that helps us to understand what we do, but then using Tina's model, we also then understand based on these different time steps of where the climate refuge is, how long these actions would yield the expected population level results. Next slide. And so it's slightly different from different stakeholder engagement processes, where with co-production, I see it as an opportunity to ensure that research outcomes are useful and applicable to various decisions, yet the outcome that you strive for is still a research product. With structured decision-making, it's much more of a process that focuses on the decision, and the ultimate outcome is a decision where you incorporate best available science in your decision-making, but you don't undertake new research unless there's clear value of information that suggests that additional information will improve your decision-making. So that's a slightly different approach we took here. Next slide. And what I want to show on this slide is we're also trying to understand with this project how we overcome the many hurdles in the knowledge to action process, and where many of our climate adaptation planning efforts yield a clear sense of what the optimal actions are, we still struggle to move from planning to implementation. And what Wright et al. Did is a meta-analysis of 12 case studies that was, all of these 12 case studies were using the structured decision-making to arrive at a selection of optimal climate adaptation or conservation actions. And it was studying what took place. So you have A through L or 12 projects. From 1 to 10 is the spectrum going from planning to implementation and then measuring benefits on the ground. And so basically what you see is that you have project H through L basically managed to complete the planning process, but they were not able to identify funding to then implement the actions. And then projects 3C through F were actually projects that not only managed to secure funding, but also get over that hump. So the yellow line highlights sort of the hurdle, the barrier to implementation. So they got over that barrier, they actually implemented actions, but you only have A and B, two projects that actually got as far as seeing near-term conservation success. So this slide really shows the challenges to getting to the desired outcomes. And while we could look at this as a cup is half empty, we do have two success stories. And really the key to that was having leadership early on and having funding to implement the project identified early on that's paired with monitoring of success. So there are some hopeful messages in that manuscript, in this Wright et al. Paper, that if we identify leadership and funding for implementation early on as we begin the planning process, we could actually get to the end. And so that is really what this project is aimed to focus on. Next step, next slide. We are right at this critical injunction. We are very close to having identified the optimal set of actions to implement in the Tuolumne and Merced watershed. And so the really key next step is to identify the leadership and then also the funding that can not only do the science of monitoring the implementation, but also have the staffing to implement these actions on the ground. And that's our next important step. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I think that's really helpful context, and that's something we want to talk about a little bit during the discussions, is how do we help get to that critical implementation phase? That's always the hard one, right?
Yep.
Okay, so then